Late September 1887, in the Medicine Bow Range of the Wyoming Territory. The cutting wind was already carrying the first true bite of autumn down from the high peaks, a signal every homesteader in the valley recognized. An early and brutal winter was imminent. Yet, while his neighbors busied themselves stacking cords of firewood and meticulously sealing their log walls with fresh moss and clay chinking, one man was engaged in an activity that completely defied frontier common sense. He was meticulously wrapping his entire cabin in heavy canvas. This wasn't just a temporary cover for the roof or a single drafty wall. The whole structure, every log, corner, and visible gap, disappeared beneath dozens of yards of rugged tent cloth. It was stretched drum-tight and lashed down with ropes, looking as though he were preparing to sail the cabin across an ocean of snow and ice. His neighbors naturally watched the process with fascination. Then they scoffed. Soon, they openly labeled him wasteful, desperate, and even suggested something far worse. An established, experienced builder swore the man was simply throwing good money into the howling wind. A former Union Army quartermaster declared he had seen soldiers freeze to death who possessed better common sense than this man. But 6 weeks later, when the worst blizzard in a decade tore down from the Rocky Mountains, the facts spoke for themselves. Only one cabin in that entire valley managed to keep its inhabitants comfortably warm while burning barely half the firewood consumed by every other household. Only that single, wrapped structure remained entirely unshaken, while others lost shingles, shutters, and in at least 2 documented cases, entire sections of their roofing. What key principle did this solitary homesteader grasp about heat retention and wind resistance that men with 2 decades of hard-earned frontier experience had completely overlooked? If you are ready to discover the forgotten engineering brilliance hidden within America's pioneer past, practical techniques that could still save your life or drastically reduce your heating bill today, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Because the knowledge you are about to receive transcends mere history. It is essential survival wisdom that modern construction science is only just beginning to rediscover. The man's name was Edmund Carver, and he had arrived in the Medicine Bow Valley only 14 months prior, accompanied by a wagon, a mule, and a worn leather satchel filled with complex surveying tools. He was not a traditional farmer, nor was he a rancher. Land Office records identified him as a railroad surveyor hailing from Pennsylvania, but the projected rail line he had been mapping was abandoned when his company filed for bankruptcy that spring. Consequently, he filed a standard homestead claim, just like thousands of others, and proceeded to build himself a basic cabin. It was nothing elaborate, a simple 16 by 20-foot structure built from lodgepole pine logs, featuring a stone hearth and a basic shake roof. It represented competent, standard frontier construction. His neighbors, most of whom were second- or third-year settlers themselves, assumed he would manage well enough. But in late September, Edmund rode into the trading post at Elk Mountain Station and made an astonishing purchase: 68 yards of heavy canvas tent cloth. This was the rugged, linseed oil waterproofed material typically used for freight wagon covers. It was extraordinarily expensive, totaling nearly $40, an amount exceeding what most homesteaders budgeted for their entire season's supplies. When the incredulous trader inquired about its purpose, Edmund simply replied that he was wrapping his cabin. News traveled quickly in a valley where barely 14 families lived within a full day's ride of one another. By the time Edmund arrived back at his claim, nearly half his neighbors had already heard the story. By the close of the week, 3 men had ridden over specifically to witness the madness for themselves. And what they discovered truly looked ridiculous. Edmund had already begun work on the south wall. The heavy canvas hung in long vertical strips, each overlapping the next by 6 inches. They stretched continuously from the roof beam down past the foundation logs and were securely staked into the ground. He had erected a simple wooden framework, consisting of nothing more than thin battens nailed horizontally every 3 feet, to deliberately hold the fabric away from the underlying log wall. The gap between the canvas and the wood was a mere 4 inches, yet this space was calculated and carefully maintained using small wooden spacers he had whittled from scrap pine. You planning to live in a tent, Carver? Samuel Hendricks asked. Hendricks ran cattle on the northern bench and was a veteran of 4 harsh Wyoming winters. Or do you just have more money than sense? Edmund did not look up from the rope he was meticulously threading through grommets along the edge of the canvas. Neither, he said. I'm planning to stay warm. Logs stay warm, Hendricks countered. That's what logs are for. You truly believe cloth is going to make a difference? Dead air helps, Edmund replied simply. The cloth just holds it in place. Hendricks rode away, vigorously shaking his head in disbelief. By October, when Edmund had finished wrapping all 4 walls and was securely lashing down the final corners, the mockery had become the main topic of conversation throughout the entire settlement. Women gossiped about it over their quilting frames. Men cracked jokes while hauling heavy timber. Even the children had invented a simple, mocking rhyme. Carver's tent, Carver's folly, wrapped his house like it's a dolly. Yet, Edmund Carver neither argued nor defended himself. He offered no explanation for the precise calculations he had scratched into the margins of his surveying notebooks, figures concerning thermal conductivity, convective currents, and the high R value of trapped air, concepts that no one in that isolated valley would have comprehended regardless. He simply finished lashing the last rope, double-checked every critical seam, and settled in to wait for winter to either vindicate his efforts or freeze him solid. What Edmund had engineered was far from madness. It was, in effect, a highly efficient double-wall envelope system, a concept that would not become standard in American building codes for another 4 decades, but one that had already been successfully proven in ship cabins, Arctic expedition shelters, and remote, high-altitude mining camps across 3 continents. The underlying physical principle was elegantly simple. Heat loss occurs not just through conduction via solid materials, but primarily through the movement of air. Convection currents relentlessly pull warm air away from a heated surface and replace it with chilling cold air. A standard, single-wall log cabin, even one meticulously chinked, still permits air to move across the internal surface of the logs. External wind creates significant pressure differentials, while the cold temperatures conduct heat relentlessly outward. The result is a constant, invisible hemorrhage of warmth. However, if a layer of still, trapped air is placed between 2 barriers, convection is dramatically suppressed. This pocket of static air then becomes effective insulation, one of the most effective natural insulators known. Carver's 4-inch gap, sealed tightly at the top and bottom, created precisely what modern engineers term a dead airspace. External wind could not penetrate it, and crucial convection currents could not establish themselves within it. The canvas exterior absorbed the full wind load and blocked all air infiltration. Meanwhile, the inner log wall radiated heat inward, retaining that warmth securely, shielded from the moving, cold air outside. The choice of canvas itself was critically important. Edmund had not selected it haphazardly. Heavy-duty duck cloth, treated with linseed oil for waterproofing, was rugged enough to resist intense wind shear. Crucially, however, it remained porous enough to allow moisture vapor to escape. This meant the inner log walls could still breathe, releasing the internal humidity generated by cooking, respiration, and the natural drying of the wood itself. This prevented trapped condensation, which would otherwise lead to timber rot or saturation of the insulation space. He installed the material in precise, overlapping vertical strips, ensuring each piece ran continuously from the roof line down to the ground. By eliminating horizontal seams, he removed vulnerable points where wind might start to peel the fabric back. Where 2 strips met, he overlapped them by 6 inches and secured both edges to the batten framework. This technique effectively created a shingled surface that efficiently shed rain and snow downward. The battens themselves, thin pine strips nailed horizontally every 3 feet, performed a critical double duty. First, they maintained the canvas at the exact 4-inch spacing Edmund had calculated. Second, they distributed the tensile load across the entire wall surface, preventing the fabric from sagging or dramatically ballooning during powerful winds. At the foundation, he extended the canvas 6 inches below the bottom log and buried the edge in a shallow trench, which was then backfilled with clay. This crucial step sealed the dead air space at ground level and deterred rodents from nesting in the insulation gap. At the roofline, he brought the fabric up and over the eaves and lashed it securely to the roof beams with tarred rope, establishing a continuous, monolithic weather barrier from ground to peak. The physics were truly elegant. On a bitter night when the external temperature plummeted to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the canvas surface might cool slightly to 22 or 23 degrees. But the trapped air in the 4-inch gap, completely immobilized and thus unable to lose heat via convection, would stabilize at a surprisingly mild 40 degrees. This meant the interior log surface, warmed by the hearth and buffered by that dead air layer, could effortlessly maintain a temperature of 65 or even 70 degrees, all while consuming a mere fraction of the fuel a conventional cabin demanded. In modern building science terms, Edmund had constructed an R-12 to R-13 wall assembly, this in an era when most frontier cabins barely achieved an R-3 or R-4 rating. He had reduced total heat loss by approximately 70%. While he never would have employed those specific numerical figures, he understood, based on careful observation and a surveyor's innate understanding of thermodynamics, that truly still air provided insulation superior to simply relying on thick logs. His neighbors merely saw expensive fabric foolishly flapping in the wind. Edmund, however, saw the cheapest, most resource-effective insulation system a homesteader could possibly construct using 19th-century materials. And he knew, with absolute and quiet certainty, that when winter finally arrived in earnest, the resulting difference would be measurable, in degrees of comfort, in cords of salvaged wood, and possibly in human lives. The wave of criticism arrived from every corner of the settlement. Yet, the loudest voices belonged to men whose established experience should have taught them caution about definitive certainty. James Dalton, for example, had been a master carpenter back in Ohio before the Panic of 1873 drove him west. He had personally constructed barns, churches, and 3-story homes. When he saw Edmund's canvas walls, he didn't just laugh. He delivered a stinging lecture. "You've got no fundamental understanding of structure, Carver," Dalton stated, standing in Edmund's dooryard with his arms tightly crossed. "Logs need to breathe. You smother them like that, you'll have rot from foundation to ridge pole inside 2 years, and that fabric won't survive a single winter. The first big wind, it'll shred like old newspaper." Edmund, who was currently reinforcing a corner tie-down, paused and looked up. "This fabric is specifically rated for wagon trains crossing the Rockies," he pointed out. "If it can handle 6 months of trail wind, it can certainly handle a Wyoming winter. Wagon covers don't stay up all winter." Dalton shot back immediately. "They get packed away, dried out, and stored properly. You leave that thing exposed to continuous freeze-thaw cycles. It'll be ragged by March." Then there was William Good, a former quartermaster in the Union Army, who asserted he possessed a knowledge of cold weather supply logistics far surpassing any civilians. He specifically rode over to accuse Edmund of sheer wastefulness. "You spent $40 on canvas," Good declared, his breath clouding in the sharp October chill. "Do you realize what $40 buys? It buys 4 cords of good, split pine. That's enough firewood to keep a standard cabin warm all winter long with surplus to spare. Instead, you've wrapped your house in cloth that will do nothing but catch snow. 4 cords will keep a leaky cabin barely livable," Edmund countered calmly. 2 cords will keep this one comfortable." Good snorted derisively. "You planning to burn magic wood, are you?" "I'm planning to keep the heat I create rather than feeding it constantly to the wind." Even the women of the settlement participated, though their scorn was quieter, shared over the sounds of bread baking and mending circles. Margaret Hendricks, Samuel's wife, informed the other wives that Edmund Carver was either a simple fool or a moral coward, terrified of the modest cold of the frontier and attempting to build himself a feather bed in the wilderness. "My grandmother raised 9 children in a sod house in Nebraska," Margaret insisted. "No canvas, no fancy ideas, just earth and grass and backbone. These modern men, they want everything soft." But the harshest judgment was reserved for the valley's eldest resident, a former trapper named Josiah Crenshaw, who had endured 32 winters in the unforgiving Rockies and regarded himself as the final, undisputed authority on mountain survival. Crenshaw rode up on a dreary November afternoon as the first dusting of snow was already visible on the peaks. He sat motionless on his horse, staring at Edmund's wrapped cabin, before finally spitting forcefully into the dirt. "You know what kills men out here, Carver?" he demanded. "Stupidity. Thinking you're smarter than the land, believing you can outsmart winter itself with cheap tricks." Edmund was busy checking the tension on his corner ropes. "Not trying to outsmart anything," he replied. "Just trying to stay warm efficiently." Efficiently, Crenshaw repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "I've seen men freeze to death wrapped in thick buffalo robes, buried in deep snow caves, huddled in shelters twice as clever as this contraption. You honestly think canvas is going to save you when it's 30 below zero and the wind is screaming straight down from Canada?" "I think dead air is going to save me," Edmund stated simply. "The canvas just holds it in place." Crenshaw shook his head, his disapproval profound. "You'll learn," he warned. "This country doesn't care about your fancy theories. It cares about what works. And what works is thick walls, big fires, and respect for how things have always been done." He rode off immediately, without uttering another word, and Edmund returned to tensioning his ropes. The settlement had rendered its unanimous verdict. Edmund Carver was a fool, squandering his precious money and effort on an audacious experiment certain to fail at the first true test. His cabin looked utterly absurd, a hefty log structure gift-wrapped like a child's present, appearing slightly bulky and unnatural beneath the taut fabric that they assumed would soon shred, rot, or simply prove useless when the depths of winter finally arrived. If you are enjoying this rediscovered piece of frontier engineering genius, smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Because what happens when the massive blizzard strikes will silence every single critic and fundamentally change how this entire valley builds its shelters. Drop a comment below and let us know what crucial, old-time survival technique you think modern people have completely forgotten. By the second week of November, the active mockery had dissolved into quiet indifference. People ceased riding over to stare, and the jokes faded away. They simply assumed Edmund would recognize his failure once the serious cold arrived, quietly tear down the embarrassing canvas, and then endure the winter just like everyone else, cold, smoky, burning wood from before dawn until well past midnight merely to keep the frost from forming on the water bucket. They were completely unaware that the decisive test of Edmund's work was already approaching, and it would be a storm more severe than any of them were prepared to face. The initial warning came from the sky itself. On November 9, 1887, the morning sun ascended into a band of sickly, pale green along the eastern horizon, a telltale color every stockman and settler in Wyoming knew heralded deep trouble. By midday, the temperature had fallen a full 12 degrees. By sunset, the wind had shifted sharply to the northwest, carrying the distinct scent of distant snow from 200 miles away. Josiah Crenshaw, the veteran trapper, rode through the valley that evening, stopping at every cabin. "Big one coming," he announced grimly. "Maybe tomorrow night, maybe the night after. Get your stock secured close. Get your wood stacked inside. Don't plan on leaving your dooryard for 3 days minimum." The settlers heeded Crenshaw's warning. The old trapper did not exaggerate. If he predicted a bad storm, it would be catastrophic. Edmund spent the entirety of November 10th meticulously checking every inch of his canvas installation. He retightened ropes that had stretched slack, reinforced 2 battens that showed the slightest movement, and personally inspected every grommet, overlap, and ground stake. He was confident the system was structurally sound, but this would be its first true trial, and he knew the stakes were high. He also stacked 18 days' worth of split firewood inside the cabin. He did this not because he anticipated needing such a large supply, but because he desired a controlled, measurable comparison. If his thermal calculations proved correct, he would use half the fuel a conventional cabin required. If he was wrong, he would at least have enough wood to survive his own mistake. The storm arrived on the night of November 11th. It did not approach gradually, it struck instantaneously. At 9:47 p.m. Edmund noted the time precisely by his pocket watch, just as the wind slammed into the cabin like a massive, physical blow. One moment, the air was still and coldly expectant. The very next moment, the entire structure shuddered violently as a gust, estimated to exceed 50 miles per hour, hammered the north wall. The heavy canvas boomed like a stretched drumhead. It was pulled taut, yet it held. Edmund, sitting by the hearth with a book he was no longer capable of reading, watched the fabric bulge inward slightly, only to snap back as the pine battens expertly distributed the immense load. There was no tearing, no structural failure, only a deep, resonant vibration that soon settled into a steady, deafening roar as the wind found its terrible, consistent rhythm. Next came the snow. These were not soft flakes, but ice pellets hard as driven sand, propelled almost horizontally by winds Edmund later estimated at 60 miles per hour, with gusts surging towards 75. The sound of this impact against the canvas was like continuous rifle fire, a deafening hammering that would have been utterly unbearable inside a simple tent, but which was effectively muffled by the log walls and the dead air gap into a distant, almost oddly soothing static. The outside temperature dropped ruthlessly, falling from 28 degrees Fahrenheit at sunset to 4 degrees by midnight. By 3 a.m. on November 12th, it had reached 6 degrees below zero. Inside Edmund's cabin, however, with only a moderate fire burning in the hearth, the kind of modest blaze that, in a conventional cabin, would barely keep the chill off, the temperature stabilized at a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. This precision wasn't guesswork. Edmund had strategically placed 3 thermometers at varying heights and distances from the hearth. All 3 gauges registered within 2 degrees of one another. The data confirmed his design. The heat was neither pooling uselessly at the ceiling nor concentrated solely near the firebox. It was evenly distributed, remarkably stable, and held fast by walls engineered to prevent the simple, costly escape of warmth into the howling, sub-zero cold outside. The blizzard raged for a relentless 61 hours, 2.5 days, during which the wind speeds never dipped below 40 miles per hour and the outdoor temperature stubbornly refused to climb above 8 degrees. 43 inches of snow blanketed the valley floor, forming drifts that piled 8 to 9 feet high against the north sides of structures. Through it all, Edmund Carver burned only 1 2/3 cords of wood to maintain his cabin's comfort. This was less than half the fuel consumption that his nearest neighbor, Samuel Hendris, would later admit to burning just to stave off freezing. Edmund didn't have those reports yet, but he knew what mattered. His cabin was holding. The canvas envelope was intact. The unorthodox system that had brought him so much ridicule was performing precisely according to his calculations. Just 300 yards to the north, in a conventional log cabin chinked with clay and moss, Samuel Hendris frantically fed his fire every 45 minutes. Despite this constant labor, he watched with growing dread as hoarfrost began to form on the interior walls. His children slept bundled beneath heavy layers of wool and buffalo hide, and his wife continually refreshed heated stones, keeping them wrapped in blankets at the foot of their bed merely to ward off deep, paralyzing numbness. For 100 yards to the east, James Dalton, the master carpenter who had confidently predicted Edmund's structural failure, fared little better. The intense wind pressure tore 6 shingles from his roof and violently blew his door half off its hinges, overwhelming the latch. He spent 4 grueling hours in sub-zero whiteout conditions, fighting the gale to nail the door back into its frame. Upon returning inside, he found his cabin so bitterly cold that his water bucket had frozen solid, despite the massive, continuous fire he was forced to keep burning. 2 miles south, in a dugout shelter carved into a hillside, William Good, the former quartermaster who had dismissed Edmund's canvas as a monumental waste of money, fared the worst. He consumed 5 cords of wood during the 61 hours and still came dangerously close to losing 2 toes to severe frostbite. His fire went out at 4 a.m. on the second night, and he struggled for 90 desperate minutes in the pitch dark, his fingers so numb he could no longer feel the matches, before he managed to restart the blaze. Edmund was oblivious to these dramas. He merely sat by his moderate, efficient fire, comfortable in a cabin wrapped in $40 worth of canvas and 3 days of labor, patiently waiting for the storm to break. When the blizzard finally ceased on the morning of November 14th, the silence that followed was profound and almost deafening quiet. The wind died, the sun pierced through, and the 14 families of the Medicine Bow Valley slowly emerged into a landscape utterly transformed by ice and snow. They were a community poised to learn a very uncomfortable lesson about the critical difference between mere experience and true wisdom. The sun ascended on the 14th, the air so cold it burned sharply in the lungs. Samuel Hendris was the first to notice the impossible. Smoke was steadily rising from Edmund Carver's chimney. It was not the thick, continuous column one would expect from a man desperately trying to recover heat after a 3-day siege, but rather a thin, lazy thread. This was the smoke of a banked fire, a minimal maintenance blaze, the modest kind of warmth one might keep going on a cool autumn evening, not the necessary roaring inferno in the aftermath of the worst blizzard in a decade. Hendris trudged through thigh-deep snow to investigate. What he found made him stop 50 feet from Edmund's door. The canvas was perfectly intact, not shredded, not torn, not even noticeably damaged. There were a few scuff marks where wind-driven ice had abraded the material and some snow packed into the lower corners where drifts had accumulated, but the system had held fast. Every rope remained taut, every overlap was sealed, and the entire insulating envelope was wrapped as tightly around the log structure as if it had been installed just yesterday. When Edmund opened his door to greet his neighbor, heat practically poured out, visible, palpable warmth that made the bitterly cold air outside shimmer. "You all right, Carver?" Hendris asked, his face raw, wind-burned, and etched with exhaustion. "Fine," Edmund replied simply. "You barely made it," Hendris admitted heavily. "I burned damn near 4 cords keeping my family from freezing. Lost feeling in my hands twice." He paused, staring past Edmund into the impossibly warm interior. "My wife. How warm is it in there?" 68 degrees, Edmund said. 65 if I let the fire drop. I've been keeping it modest." Hendris could only stare. His own cabin, despite 3 days of continuous, desperate firing, had never climbed above 52 degrees. And he had burned 4 cords achieving that miserable temperature. "How much did you use?" he finally managed to ask. Edmund glanced back at his interior woodpile. "About 1 cord and 2/3. Maybe a bit less." The arithmetic was brutally decisive. Edmund had maintained a temperature 16 degrees higher than his neighbor while consuming less than half the fuel. This was no marginal improvement. This was a fundamental revolution in thermal efficiency. Word spread through the valley like wildfire. By midday, 7 families had sent representatives to carefully examine Edmund's cabin. By evening, James Dalton, the very master carpenter who had predicted structural failure, stood in Edmund's dooryard with a notebook, sketching the batten system and asking precise technical questions about grommet spacing. "I was wrong," Dalton stated bluntly. "Dead wrong. I've been building for 23 years, and I never once considered separating the wind barrier from the thermal mass. This is..." He paused, struggling visibly with the admission. "This is better than anything I've ever built." William Good arrived the following morning, his face still showing the pale, grayish stain of near frostbite. He did not apologize, men like Good rarely did, but he quietly asked if Edmund would be willing to help him install canvas on his own cabin before the next major cold snap. "It cost me $47 in wood to get through that storm," Good calculated. "You probably spent 15. I can do the math. That canvas pays for itself in 1 winter alone." Even Josiah Crenshaw, the old trapper who had previously called Edmund's methodology stupid and arrogant, rode over on November 16th. He sat motionless on his horse for a long time, intently studying the installation before he finally spoke. "I've survived 32 winters in these mountains," Crenshaw stated. "I thought that meant I knew everything worth knowing about staying warm. Turns out I just knew how to survive being cold." He nodded toward the taut canvas walls. "This ain't survival. This is comfort. And I was a fool to mock it." The most compelling evidence came from the meticulous temperature measurements Edmund recorded throughout late November and December. On nights when the outside temperature plummeted to 0 degrees or lower, his cabin reliably maintained an interior temperature between 65 degrees and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, requiring only 2 hours of active firing per day. In contrast, his neighbors in conventional log cabins reported needing 7 to 8 hours of active firing just to keep temperatures between 50 degrees and 55 degrees. The fuel savings were even more dramatic. Between November 14th and December 31st, Edmund consumed 2 1/4 cords of wood. Samuel Hendris, whose cabin was almost identical in size, burned 5 3/4 cords during the identical period. The system proved itself again in January, when a second major storm dropped the temperature to 18 degrees below zero for 4 consecutive nights. While his neighbors huddled around roaring infernos, Edmund maintained comfort with a fire that one visitor described as merely adequate for a city parlor. He achieved this while using 62% less wood than the valley average. The system's structural integrity was equally impressive. By March, after the canvas had endured 5 punishing months of freeze-thaw cycles, powerful winds, heavy snow loads, and relentless ice accumulation, Dalton returned to conduct a detailed inspection. He found only minor wear, slight fraying at the corners, some fading from sun exposure, and 2 grommets that had elongated slightly under extreme tension. But the fabric itself remained fundamentally sound. There was no rot, no major tears, and certainly no structural failures. Dalton conservatively estimated that the installation would last 3 to 5 years before needing replacement. Crucially, he observed that the recurring cost of replacing the canvas every 4 years remained vastly cheaper than the expense of the extra fuel a conventional cabin consumed in a single winter. The numbers were undeniable. Edmund Carver's canvas-wrapped cabin had definitively outperformed every traditional structure in the valley by margins too significant to dismiss as simple luck or anomaly. He had successfully cut his heating costs by more than half and maintained comfort levels his neighbors couldn't achieve even with unlimited firewood. He accomplished this with a system so elegant and simple that any settler with basic carpentry skills and access to canvas could replicate it in a matter of days. The mockery had abruptly ceased, replaced now by persistent, eager questions. The Medicine Bow Valley was on the cusp of a profound transformation in frontier building practices, a revolution that would soon ripple across Wyoming Territory and beyond. By late February 1888, 3 cabins in the valley had already been retrofitted with canvas envelope systems based directly on Edmund Carver's design. By the end of April, that number had swelled to 11. Samuel Hendris was the first true convert. He installed canvas initially on his north and west walls, the directions that bore the brunt of the winter winds, and immediately reported a 38% reduction in wood consumption, even with only partial coverage. The following autumn, he completed the full envelope and wrote to his brother in Nebraska, "I am warmer this winter than I have ever been in Wyoming, and I am burning less wood than I burned in October alone last year. The man we mocked has saved us all a fortune, and possibly our very lives." James Dalton did not merely adopt the technique, he meticulously refined it. Collaborating with Edmund, he developed an improved batten system using wider boards and a staggered nailing pattern to distribute stress across the fabric more evenly. Dalton also successfully experimented with a double layer of canvas in high wind areas, creating an even deeper pocket of dead air that pushed thermal performance to levels Edmund had not thought achievable. This enhanced Dalton design added another 8 to 10% in fuel efficiency. Meanwhile, William Good, the former quartermaster, shrewdly converted the innovation into commerce. He began purchasing canvas in bulk from suppliers in Cheyenne and Laramie, reselling it to settlers throughout the territory at cost, while offering his labor for installation at eminently reasonable rates. By 1890, Good had helped install canvas envelopes on 43 structures across 4 counties, his new reputation as a thermal efficiency expert completely eclipsing his former identity as a bitter skeptic. Even Josiah Crenshaw, the veteran trapper, ultimately adopted a modified version for his remote line cabin. He employed a lighter canvas and a simpler framework, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged, creating a layer of dead air between barriers. At 64 years old, after spending more than 3 decades accepting brutal, punishing cold as the inevitable price of mountain living, he experienced his first truly comfortable winter. He later admitted to Edmund that he should have been asking thoughtful questions instead of issuing scornful pronouncements. The technique quickly spread beyond individual homesteads. During the winter of 1888-89, a mining camp located 30 miles north of the valley faced a catastrophic supply crisis when early snow trapped their freight wagons, cutting off their winter provisions. Staring down the barrel of burning through their limited firewood reserves in a matter of weeks, the camp foreman, Victor Chun, who had heard about Edmund's cabin from a cousin in Medicine Bow, organized an emergency canvas installation project that successfully wrapped 12 bunkhouses in just 5 days. The results were so dramatically effective that the mining company's engineers documented them in formal, internal reports. Fuel consumption dropped by 61%, interior temperatures rose an average of 14 degrees, and the camp weathered the entire supply shortage without a single reported case of cold-related injury or illness. The company directly attributed this survival to the thermal efficiency gains provided by the canvas envelope system. By 1892, variations of Edmund's design had proliferated across homesteader cabins, mining camps, and even military outposts throughout Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. While installation methods diversified, some used oilcloth instead of canvas, others built more elaborate framework systems, and some integrated the concept into entirely new construction. The core principle remained constant. Properly trapped and sealed dead air was one of the most powerful and accessible insulators available to frontier builders. The fabric envelope was not just a mere shelter modification. It represented a fundamental rethinking of how wooden structures retained heat. What Edmund Carver had intuitively grasped, and what his critics had entirely missed, was that thick walls alone do not guarantee warmth. Air movement mattered profoundly. Convection mattered. The ability to create and meticulously maintain a stable thermal boundary mattered far more than the raw material mass of the logs. Modern building science would ultimately catch up. By the 1920s, building paper and early forms of house wrap started appearing in residential construction. By the 1960s, dedicated air barriers and comprehensive thermal envelope systems became standard practice in cold climate building codes. And by the early 21st century, advanced building wraps, vapor barriers, and insulated sheathing systems were achieving thermal performance levels that Edmund would have recognized immediately. They were simply accomplishing with synthetic materials and petroleum products what he had done with canvas and trapped air. The profound historical irony was not lost on researchers who later studied frontier building practices. The primitive homesteaders of the 1880s, working with basic hand tools and rudimentary materials, had independently discovered and implemented core thermal principles that would not be formally codified by professional engineers and architects for another 50 years. They simply called it common sense instead of our value. Edmund Carver never patented his system, never authored a technical paper, and never sought recognition beyond the borders of his small community. He simply built what was effective, proved its efficacy through the brutal laboratory of a Wyoming winter, and shared the knowledge freely with anyone who cared to listen. He resumed his surveying work when the railroad returned to the territory in the 1890s. In 1894, he sold his original canvas-wrapped cabin to a young family from Illinois. The structure, still encased in the original, though heavily weathered, fabric, served them reliably for another 6 years before they finally replaced the canvas, and then used the cabin for 7 more years. The technique itself showed remarkable persistence. As late as 1911, Forest Service records documented canvas envelope shelters at remote ranger stations throughout the Rocky Mountains. A trapper's journal from northern Montana, dated 1923, describes a cabin wrapped in layered freight cloth over logs, built the way the old-timers did it when canvas was cheaper than coal. The last known installation built to Edmund's exact original specifications, a line cabin constructed in the Medicine Bow National Forest in 1889, was documented by a WPA surveyor in 1936. The canvas had been replaced 3 times over nearly 5 decades, but the underlying batten framework remained original. It was still in regular use by sheep herders who reported that it remained the warmest shelter in the entire high country. The cabin proved what Edmund knew in 1887, what his neighbors discovered in that bitter November storm, and what modern building science would eventually confirm with sophisticated instruments and computational models. Innovation does not always flow from established experts. Sometimes it emerges from a single person willing to think carefully, calculate honestly, and ignore public mockery long enough to demonstrate that the impossible is merely the untested. If this narrative of frontier innovation and forgotten wisdom has inspired you, please do us a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more lost knowledge unearthed from America's pioneer past. And drop a comment telling us what survival technique you believe deserves to be remembered. Because the old-timers understood things that we are still trying to relearn today. And sometimes, the most truly advanced technology is simply common sense carefully and meticulously applied. The canvas-wrapped cabin in the Medicine Bow Valley began as one man's strange experiment and ultimately became a potent testament to the value of questioning long-held assumptions. The neighbors who scorned Edmund Carver in September 1887 were diligently building his design into their own cabins by the spring of 1888. They had learned the uncomfortable truth that every generation eventually confronts. Dismissing unfamiliar ideas as foolish often reveals not the ignorance of the innovator, but the fundamental limitations of the critic. And survival, whether on the frontier or anywhere else, belongs not to those who cling hardest to tradition, but to those willing to rigorously test new solutions against old problems, following the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to wrapping your entire cabin in a tent. A brief educational advisory. This script is designed to present a historical narrative, focusing on frontier building practices and the thermal engineering principles common in the 1880s American West. While the construction techniques described are genuinely based on documented methods of vernacular architecture and founded in sound physical principles, it must be emphasized that this is a dramatized educational story and should not be taken as professional construction or engineering advice. All modern building projects and renovations must strictly adhere to current building codes, safety standards, and the guidance provided by certified professionals.